Hello, my name is Matthew Henderson, and I'm a PhD candidate in the Wild Minds Lab at the University of St. Andrews. Today, I'll be doing a reading of one of our papers titled Shared Semantics, Exploring the Interface Between Human and Chimpanzee Gestural Communication, which was co-authored by myself, Patrick Groves, Kirsty Graham, Catherine Hobader, and Priti Patel Groves, and was published in Mind and Language in 2024. Links to the original paper, including its tables, figures, references, and supplementary materials, can be found at our lab's website at greatapedictionary.ac.uk. And with that, let's dive in. Abstract. Striking similarities across ape gestural repertoires suggest shared phylogenetic origins that likely provided a foundation for the emergence of language. We pilot a novel approach for exploring possible semantic universals across human and non-human ape species. In a forced choice task, 300 participants watched 10 chimpanzee gesture forms performed by a human and chose from responses that paralleled inferred meanings for chimpanzee gestures. Participants agreed on a single meaning for 9 gesture forms. In 6 of these, the agreed form meaning pair responses match those established for chimpanzees. Such shared understanding suggests apes, including humans, gesturing shares deep evolutionary origins. Section 1. Introduction. There remains substantial debate over when and how language emerged in modern human communication. Recent developments in primatology have led to an increase in data on non-human great ape, hereafter ape, gesture forms and meanings. Simultaneously, there is a large and growing body of literature on gesture in humans. This rapid expansion of interest has brought with it challenges in aligning the work across human and non-human ape gesture, with the diversity of approaches taken to how gesture is operationalized within humans and other apes. An important question that has gained prominence in gesture research concerns the existence of gesture universals. For example, considering the presence of universal gesture forms, and even gestural form-meaning pairings, across cultures within the human species and across ape species. Recent studies comparing human and ape gesture found striking similarities. Pre-linguistic 1 to 2-year-old human infants naturally used 46 ape-typical gesture forms, and language-proficient adult humans correctly interpreted the meanings of commonly occurring chimpanzee and bonobo gesture forms, as proposed in primatology research. These species overlaps suggest that a similar gestural repertoire was plausibly present in the last common ancestor of all humans, bonobos, and chimpanzees, roughly 7.6 million years ago. Relatedly, recent research in semantics proposed the existence of semantic universals in the shape of abstract meaning components, or atoms, which are generalized fragments of meaning found across languages, that all humans have access to and that then form parts of more complex meanings. In tandem, recent work comparing gesture use across great ape species, on the basis of which gesture meanings are inferred, has found that chimpanzees and bonobos, whose last common ancestor lived between 1 to 1.8 million years ago, overlap to an extent that is greater than expected by chance, supporting a shared origin of understanding of gestural meanings. Bringing these perspectives on gesture form and meaning together, we move beyond established similarities of gestural forms across primate species, and ask whether there are abstract gestural form-meaning pairings that are shared between humans and other great apes. To do so, we ask whether these ape gestures can also be performed as human gestures that communicate comparable meanings. From a big-picture perspective, we are not looking for concrete semantic meanings of gestural forms here, such as universal gesture for move away. This has already been unsuccessfully attempted elsewhere. Rather, we are exploring how some abstract meaning atoms may form an underlying structure to gesture production in apes, with our intended level of abstractness being exemplified by abstract notions such as the encouragement of some exchange, or its discouragement. Therefore, for this study, we chose to use a broad definition of gesture as a communicative body movement. Universal gestural form-meaning pairings, in the sense that they are shared by humans and other apes, if they exist, may be a result of shared biological inheritance. For example, African apes living in distinct environments share around 90% of their gestural repertoires. From an evolutionary perspective, this extensive overlap within African apes naturally suggests an innate component. However, gestural commonalities may also result from shared physical/cognitive needs and capacities in early communicative exchanges. For example, requests to move closer, move away, or give it to me are likely to be common communicative acts resulting from shared needs across all apes, and require similar cognitive capacities, such as the recognition of others as distinct agents and, in some cases, the ability to refer to external items of interest. Similarly, humans and apes share similar body plans, e.g. joint/limb configuration and similar sensory perceptions, as well as having comparable interactions with their external world, e.g. the meaning move away of a push gesture, as shared by bonobos and chimpanzees, may be co-opted from the physical action of pushing something away. An important distinction between biological research on non-human animals and linguistic research on human communication concerns their respective null hypotheses. In biological research, the typical null hypothesis for the origin of similar features between closely related species would be its shared emergence in a common ancestor. And so for our study, the biological null hypothesis is that atypical gesture form-meaning pairings would be derived from a phylogenetic origin, which we'll call the phylogenetic gesture hypothesis. By contrast, the typical linguistic null hypothesis assumes the communicative form-meaning pairings, such as the many used in language, are required and learned during an individual's lifetime. So the linguistic null hypothesis here would be that atypical gesture form-meaning pairings are similarly acquired/learned by each species, which we call the acquired gesture hypothesis. While any single hypothesis that falls too heavily on one side of this classic nature versus nurture debate almost certainly does not fully encapsulate the complex story behind the evolution of gesture form-meaning pairings in apes. Much of the research in wild apes suggests some correspondencies owing to a phylogenetic origin in at least form. For example, while ontogenetic ritualization, a proposed process where fully functional actions become truncated into communicative signals through repeated interactions between conspecifics and their environment, may help explain some gestural form-meaning pairings between specific individuals, it does not predict the substantial overlap of gestural repertoires across individuals, communities, and species that has been found in the wild apes. Additionally, the finding that the chimpanzee gestural repertoire only employs 12.3% of their possible maximum repertoire size exemplifies the level of diversity that could exist even within a species, but simply does not. Iconicity may also give rise to shared form-meaning pairings. However, the presence of iconicity in apes, as well as to the extent to which apes perceive it, remains debated. We have now reached a point where the empirical findings within primatology and linguistics can inform one another. Here, we pilot an interdisciplinary method that applies and refines recently established experimental methodology from Graham and Hobader 2023 for the exploration of ape gestures to modern language-using humans. Gestural studies in great apes have focused on the gesture's use as imperative demands, where the signaler requests the recipient to make something happen in the external world. These gestural requests require behavioral responses that are readily observable. Based on such observations, researchers can infer the gesture's meaning, but this approach potentially fails to capture a wider range of other non-imperative types of meanings. Nevertheless, furthering our understanding of the universal features of a gesture in great apes begins with such gestures. In linguistic research, these imperative demands can be classified as directives or directive speak acts, that is, attempts by the speaker to get the hearer to do something. We thus label them as directive gestures. When viewing the current research from this combined primatology-linguistics perspective, we hypothesize that the communication of directive meanings via gestural forms in great ape species might still be contained in the gesturing of humans, providing a structure of core meanings that are integrated into human communicative interactions due to their universal nature, and which are potentially further built upon in the generation of more complex meanings. We investigate whether, when viewing a chimpanzee gesture with an established chimpanzee meaning, which was subsequently produced by a human, do adult humans infer the same meanings as attested in chimpanzees? To address this, we specifically ask, do adult humans agree on the same meanings for a particular gesture form, and to what extent do they infer the same meaning inferences as chimpanzees? Section 2. Methods. We created 10 brief videos of commonly used chimpanzee gestures for which we had established chimpanzee meanings. See supporting information for details on gesture form pairing meanings and their selection, performed by a human adult, CH, who is an expert in chimpanzee gestures, hereafter the signaler, directed at another human adult, PP-G, hereafter the recipient. These videos were shown to adult human participants, 300, in a forced choice task with 4 possible responses. All response options were based on meanings for which chimpanzees use their gestures. 1. Tight gesture forms, or 2. Flexible gesture forms, see below. Of these response options match the most frequent meanings in chimpanzees' use of each gesture. The remaining 3 or 2 response options were distractors, taken from meanings used for other gesture forms. Participants were prompted to select which of these 4 responses they thought the signaler wanted to communicate to the recipient by means of their performed gesture. Participants in the study were not informed in advance that they were viewing gestures from the chimpanzee repertoire or given any indication that this may be the case. Instead, They were fully debriefed on this and other aspects after taking the study. Section 2.1. Selection of gesture forms and meaning paraphrases. Our experiment applied the methodology of the Great Ape Dictionary experiment, see Methods by Graham and Hobater 2023, which employed a forced choice paradigm, a frequently used method in psychological studies to assess implicit understanding or knowledge. In the Great Ape Dictionary experiment, participants were presented with a video of an ape gesture and offered 4 responses to choose from. Here, we recreated chimpanzee gesture forms with established chimpanzee meanings in a human-to-human interaction. Great apes have large repertoires of around 80 gesture forms. The 10 gesture forms that we used here were chosen on the grounds that, firstly, they could plausibly occur in a naturalistic interaction between 2 humans. Ruling out non-manual gestures, such as side roulade, whose description is body is rotated around the head-feet axis while laying on the ground with horizontal displacement along the ground. Or certain manual gestures such as big loud scratch, whose description is loud exaggerated scratching movement on the signaler's own body. Secondly, their objective meanings would be plausible in an exchange between 2 adult humans in an informal setting. We did not include gestures where the chimpanzee meanings were improbable or inappropriate, including sexual behavior, grooming, and carrying. The ape gesture forms used were established in studies that define gesture as discrete, mechanically ineffective physical movements of the body observed during periods of intentional communication. As a result, while contact gestures such as push and grab hold were included, they explicitly could not function as signals that achieved their goals through mechanical force. In chimpanzees, Hobater and Byrne 2014 inferred the signaler's intended meanings based on their apparently satisfactory outcomes, or ASOs. ASOs refer to reactions on the part of the recipient that makes the signaler stop gesturing. For example, if a signaler performs an arm raise gesture and stops performing the gesture when the receiver starts approaching the signaler, then we can conclude that the gesture's meaning was move closer. This usage-based approach to the meanings of gestures uses the term meaning in a sense that descriptively captures the successful use of a gesture in a given instance and uses multiple successful instances to construct a distribution of meanings for that gesture form, which is how we use the term throughout this article. This does not preclude the existence of more abstract underlying gesture meanings in the sense that the meanings move away and stop that may be contextual realizations of a more abstract negative meaning that constitutes the gesture's lexical entry, such as a non-specified stop meaning, which may be contextually enriched to stop being so close or stop your current activity, as proposed by Patel-Gross in 2023. Important updates on the chimpanzee gestural repertoire from Hobater and Byrne 2014 that inform Table S1 include Byrne et al. 2017, in which the gesture grab was split into grab and grab hold, and the gesture reach was split into reach and reach wrist. Note that there is no one-to-one correspondence between gesture forms and their meanings. Gesture forms may have more than one meaning, and some meanings are expressed by more than one gesture. For instance, the gesture forms arm raise and beckon can both communicate move closer in chimpanzees, while hand fling and hit object can both communicate move away. The use of a single gesture form to communicate multiple meanings can complicate analyses, particularly where some meanings may be genuine but rarely expressed, while others may represent noise or misunderstanding by observers. Cartmill and Byrne 2010 distinguish tight, loose, and ambiguous gestures based on the specificity of outcome matching. See also Hobater and Byrne 2014. Here, we follow a similar approach and consider 2 broad categories of gestural flexibility. Tight gestures were considered to have a single meaning where there was a single outcome associated with successful use in over 60% of cases. And flexible gestures were considered to have 2 meanings, where no single outcome was associated with use in more than 60% of cases, and 2 or more outcomes were regularly and successfully achieved by the gesture. 4 of our 10 gestures were tight and 6 were flexible. We included 2 meanings of flexible gestures to represent their multiple correct meanings. As our data do not represent a specific instance of ape usage in which one meaning was intended, compare with Graham and Hobater 2023, both meanings were considered equally correct in the video interactions. In our statistical analysis, we thus consider both meanings for flexible gestures to reflect an expected response. In practice, this meant that for tight gestures, where 1 in 4 options was correct, chance level was at 25%, whereas for flexible gestures, where 2 of 4 options were correct, chance level was at 50%. One risk of including 2 correct responses for flexible gesture forms is that the answers of participants who intuit a correct response may be split across the 2 correct responses. However, we consider this to be the methodologically conservative approach and account for it in our analysis. A further disadvantage of including both correct responses is that they may make the results more difficult to interpret. However, This way we avoid a priori decisions, eliminating experimental influence on which of the correct responses should be considered more correct than the other. In the previous literature, ASO-based great ape gesture meanings were described as statements such as acquire object, which are not necessarily intuitive for gestures performed by humans. So we created more natural translations, such as give it to me instead of acquire object. In cases where the previous descriptions were sufficiently intuitive, we kept them in their original form, such as move closer. We exclusively choose imperative paraphrases, as currently most of the established ape gesture use resembled directives in human communication. Section 2.2. Creating the video gesture stimuli. When creating the gestures, the human signaler aimed to keep, as best as possible, all non-gesturing parts of her body neutral and similar across videos, such as keeping a neutral face to avoid potentially communicative facial expressions. The gesture actions were produced with chimpanzee expressions in mind. For example, chimpanzee hands typically include some flexion in the fingers and wrist as a neutral position. Video recordings were created in the socio-cognitive laboratory of the University of Oslo, which has 4 wall-mounted cameras. Both the signaler and the recipient were adult female researchers and were sitting on a couch engaged in reading prior to gesture production. Videos were cut to include only a few frames before the interaction started, followed by the preparation and action stroke of the gesture, following Kendon 2004. Hold and recovery phases were excluded. In doing so, we excluded any signs of the signaler waiting for a response, or any eventual response from the recipient. See also the Similar Minimum Action Unit, or MAU, termed for ape gesture research. In this way, we provided the minimum information necessary to distinguish a gesture form, with no further information on the nature or success of the interaction between the two experimenters. No audio was provided with the video material, and participants were explicitly instructed that none was available. Section 2.3. Participants. The experiment was conducted as an online community science experiment using the gorilla.sc platform. Participants, n equals 300, were recruited through various social media channels, mailing lists, and word of mouth. Participation was voluntary, and participants were not paid. Participants were asked to select their birth year, so that we could only collect data from participants over 18 years old. Participants under 18 were able to assess the study in game format, but no data were collected. Ethical approval for this study was obtained in advance from the University of St. Andrews University Teaching and Research Ethics Committee with approval code PS 15109. Section 2.4. Procedure. Participation took place online and at the participants' own pace. Participants first read an information page, and if they chose to proceed, they then filled out a consent form and short demographic questionnaire, which included asking for their age, gender, and whether they had done the experiment before. The study was open for anyone who wished to partake, but as participant information was anonymous, we used the self-reported information to exclude data from participants who reported being younger than 18 years old or who had previously taken the experiment, or who at the completion of the study did not fully complete the study questions, or reported any within-experiment errors that could have impacted their results, such as video playback errors. Participants were presented with 10 trials. Each trial included a video of the gestural interaction, a humanoid gesture bot illustration indicating the movements that they should attend to, and a choice of 4 possible responses. The video showed a gesture form performed by one human experimenter to another, and were played once in real time and once slowed to 50% speed. Participants were able to rewatch each video as often as needed. They were asked to choose the response that they thought most represented what the signaler wanted to communicate to the recipient. After 10 trials, participants were shown a final screen of their score, calculated as the correspondence of their answers to chimpanzee meanings, followed by a short debrief. All participants saw the same set of available responses for each gesture form. However, the presentation order of the gesture videos was randomized. In each trial of a tight gesture, where there was only one correct response, the 4 available responses included the single expected response, such as the chimpanzee meaning, together with the 3 incorrect distractor responses. In each trial with a flexible gesture, where there were 2 correct meanings, the 4 available responses included the 2 expected responses and 2 incorrect distractor responses. All incorrect distractor responses were randomly selected from the set of other ape gesture responses used in the study. Once selected, the same distractor meanings, as well as the correct meanings and the order in which they were presented, were kept consistent across participants. Section 2.5. Analyses. We analyzed 3,000 responses from 300 participants. We performed 2 sets of exact binomial tests. The first tested whether a single, most frequent meaning was chosen more often than chance for each gesture form, and the second tested whether the chimpanzee meanings for a gesture form were chosen more frequently than expected by chance. Confidence level was set to 95%, and the alternative hypothesis was one-sided, as we tested whether the most frequent response occurred at above chance level, rather than allowing it to vary in either direction. Statistical analyses were run in RStudio 1.4.1103, running R version 4.0.3. Alpha was set to 0.05, but following Bonferroni correction for multiple testing, was adjusted to 0.005 for each of the tests. Section 2.6, Hypotheses. For each of the 10 gesture trials, the null hypothesis was that no consistent response would be assigned to the gesture across participants. Experimental null hypothesis. There is no response option consistently associated with the gesture form. The prediction? Responses are not significantly above chance level of 25%. The null hypothesis was rejected for a given gesture form when the most frequent response across all participants was above chance. If rejected, this would indicate that at least one meaning was more strongly associated with the gesture form across participants than the other meanings. This conclusion holds regardless of whether the most frequent responses corresponded to the expected chimpanzee meanings, which was checked in a second step. Correspondent hypothesis. The preferred responses for a given gesture form correspond to the established chimpanzee meanings for that gesture form. The prediction, the chimpanzee meanings for the gesture form are selected statistically above chance level, which is above 25% for tight and above 50% for flexible gestures. Non-corresponding meaning hypothesis. The preferred responses converge on the same meaning, such as gesture form T is associated with response option A, that does not correspond to the expected responses. The prediction, the most frequent response is selected statistically above chance level at 25%. It does not match the established chimpanzee meaning for that gesture form, which is above 25% for tight and above 50% for flexible gestures. Section 3. Results. Participants selected one response significantly more frequently than would be expected by chance in 9 of the 10 gesture forms. Across all answers, participants selected responses matching the chimpanzee meanings for each gesture form significantly more frequently than expected by chance, with the binomial test being 0.568, with a p under 0.001, with a lower limit of 0.553 and an upper limit of 1.0. And appeared to do so to an extent greater in the 6 flexible gesture trials, whose binomial was 0.748 with a p-value under 0.001 with a lower limit of 0.722 and an upper limit of 1.0, than the 4 tight gesture trials, whose binomial was 0.309 with a p under 0.001 and a lower limit of 0.287 and an upper limit of 1.0. Binomial tests on individual gesture forms revealed that participants selected the chimpanzee meanings significantly above chance in 6 of the 10 gesture trials, which included 5 flexible gesture forms, arm swing, beckon, grab hold, hit object, and reach palm, and 1 tight gesture form, hand fling. Section 4. Discussion. In the study, we piloted a new interdisciplinary method that employed recent findings and methods from great ape gesture research to investigate human intuitions about established chimpanzee gesture forms and meanings. Further exploration into shared gestural features between humans and chimpanzees could help to unravel the origin of potential semantic universals that could have been crucial for the emergence of human language. We hypothesized that, if both the form of chimpanzee gestures and some abstract meaning components associated with them are derived from traits present in a common ancestor with humans, then these gestural forms may have similar recognizable meanings for human adults, forming part of a universal ape-typical inventory of abstract meaning components that all human and non-human apes have access to. Applying and refining the methodology of a recent online experiment developed to assess understanding in language proficient humans of ape gesture form meaning pairs produced by other apes, we recreated these gestures in a human-to-human interaction. Study participants converged on a common response for 9 of the 10 ape gesture forms deployed in a naturalistic human interaction. The common meanings that they chose matched the established chimpanzee meanings in 6 of these 10 gestures. This pattern suggests that humans recognize these as meaningful gesture units. They independently agreed on common meanings communicated by gestural forms, which often match the same meaning of chimpanzees. As is the case in other apes, even where a gesture is most often used to communicate a single meaning, specificity varied. For the ape gesture forms with significant agreement across participants, participant agreement ranged from 39%, let's go meaning for push, to 91%, stop that meaning for hit object. However, our results did not show gesture meanings shared across species for all gesture forms. The responses given in reaction to 4 of the 10 gesture forms did not significantly correspond with their established chimpanzee gesture meanings. One gesture, reach wrist, did not exhibit a significantly most frequent response across participants, with participants' responses similarly distributed across the 4 meaning options. A further 3 gesture forms, arm raise, handshake, and push, did exhibit a significantly most frequent response, indicating a shared inference about their meanings in humans. But this response did not match the established chimpanzee meaning, or the non-corresponding meaning. There are a number of reasons why convergence on a single meaning response may have occurred for all but one gesture form, and further testing is needed to disentangle them. It is possible that humans in general will converge on some common meanings for any particular action, but our case of reach-risk shows that is not always the case. We remain agonistic as to whether convergence on a shared meaning suggests that gestural form meaning pairings are necessarily phylogenetically shaped, the phylogenetic gesture hypothesis, or whether shared patterns of action and meaning are individually acquired as a result of shared similarities in the physical structure of ape body plans and typical social interactions, the acquired gesture hypothesis. Similarly, we remain agonistic as to the possible fundamental properties of meaning in certain movements, that is, whether gesture forms can be decomposed into meaningful parts. One approach to test the phylogenetic gesture hypothesis versus the acquired gesture hypothesis would be to explore whether humans are similarly skilled at decoding meaning in the gestures of more distantly related species, such as elephants or corvids. That the meanings of these gestures did not correspond to the chimpanzee meanings may reflect the importance of contextual cues in interpreting gesture. All of the gesture form meaning pairs selected were ones that could be plausibly produced in an adult-to-adult human interaction. However, our current methods for specifying meaning in ape gesture require further development. For example, presently it would be difficult to disentangle whether a flexible gesture had two distinct lexical meanings, such as the meanings captured by the paraphrases "move closer" and "move away," or if it is communicated by a single, more general meaning, such as "move yourself," that is further specified by the recipient given the situational context. See Patel-Gross 2023 for a linguistic approach to this question. The significance of context to disambiguate meaning in gesture is increasingly supported. While interpretations of our findings are relatively speculative at this stage, we aim to conduct future studies that directly test the role of context in gestural interpretation. The gestures included in our experiment were not intended to reproduce gesture forms known to exist in adult humans, though they may unintentionally resemble some such gestures. Nor were they spontaneously produced by adult humans in natural conversation. Rather, they were controlled reenactments of established chimpanzee gestures produced as if they were human gestures. If human participants were asked to interpret the meaning of a gesture produced by a chimpanzee, as in Graham and Hobater 2023, we cannot know if the participants tried to guess what the chimpanzee is trying to communicate based on their knowledge of chimpanzee behavior, thus assuming the perspective of the chimpanzee, or if they are interpreting the gesture's meaning from the situational context, as opposed to treating the gesture as a species-independent gesture that could be used by a human. In videos of naturalistic gesture use in non-human apes, there are many uncontrolled confounds that make it difficult to discern the extent to which human observers are able to extract information on the gestural meaning based on the physical expression of the gesture, as opposed to the socio-ecological context or other accompanying signals, such as facial expressions, vocalizations, body position, etc. To help control other potential confounding variables, our videos were generated in a highly constrained setting. The signaler and recipient started each video sat in the same position and location. The signaler produced each gesture while suppressing other accompanying signals, and the recipient consistently reacted to each produced gesture. Thus, we were able to refine our investigation to how participants understood the relevant morphological actions of each gesture form without additional contextual information. We employed a novel experimental method recently developed to test human understanding of chimpanzee gestures, here performed in a human-to-human interaction. We will continue to adapt this study design to test a greater variety of gestures, meanings, and contexts. Nonetheless, our current experiment represents a crucial proof of concept, and our results remain useful for several key reasons. Firstly, our approach provided a particularly challenging test of our hypothesis, presenting minimal gestural information, tight control of situational and interactional context, and inclusion of flexible gesture forms that can, in other apes, be deployed across multiple meanings. The difficulty of the task was reflected in the feedback from participants, through the experimenter's comment section and via email. A non-trivial question is to what extent can we be certain that a human expert can recreate a chimpanzee's gesture in a way that would be recognized by a chimpanzee? While human and chimpanzee vocal anatomy is substantially different, the physiology, i.e. bones, joints, and muscles, of the limbs used by humans and chimpanzees to produce gestures is nearly identical in configuration. As a result, while the authentic reproduction of chimpanzee vocal signals by a human would not be possible, authentic reproduction of gestures is much more feasible. Nevertheless, the human expert might fail to integrate some important component of a chimpanzee's gesture, such as a slight hand movement, elbow angle, or specific finger position. However, as chimpanzee gestures are not identically produced in every instance, Their gesturing naturally contains temporal and physical variability with regards to properties such as extension, flexion, orientation, and so forth. The parts kept constant are relatively coarse, and there is no evidence that finely nuanced differences, as listed above, such as finger position, would change the meaning of a gesture in an ape. Indeed, these gestures need to be understandable to other chimpanzees in a visually complex environment of dark, dense foliage in the wild, and thus need to be robust to subtle variation in form. By only showing participants the preparation and action stroke phase of each gesture, i.e., excluding any hold, repetition, or recovery, we provided the minimally possible information on the gesture form, making the detection of differences between similar gesture forms potentially more challenging. For example, the distinction between hand fling and hand shake may be more difficult when a participant only observes the first back and forth movement without repetition. This natural ambiguity in gesture forms may underlie some of our findings. For example, in the handshake gesture form yielding a consistent but unexpected preference for the meaning of stop that, 74% of cases, it is plausible that participants interpreted the abbreviated handshake similarly to hand fling, which participants typically interpreted with the expected chimpanzee meaning move away, 77%. Future studies should present different phases of gestural movements to tease apart how participants discriminate gesture forms. By using human actors to perform ape gestures, we could control factors that are normally present in natural interactions and that may impact how gestures are understood. We excluded other accompanying signals, such as vocalizations or facial expressions, and kept situational and interactive context consistent across trials. Our videos did not include any response weighting or an outcome to the signal, which created a minimally informative environment for the interpretation of gesture meaning. Furthermore, some gestural meanings are dependent on the previous behavior of the signaler and recipient. For example, chimpanzees use push gesture forms to communicate stop that, which presupposes a previous action on part of the recipient, i.e., stop that presupposes you were doing something before. In our experiment, the video started with the recipient not engaged in any visible interaction with the signaler before the gesture. They were sitting, reading on the couch. While participants could take stop that to indicate stop reading, this may be a less plausible meaning given the benign nature of reading as an activity. However, where participants selected meanings that fit less well into the provided video context, it is possible that they either ignored the immediate context or that they prioritized a meaning that they felt best fit with the gesture's form over contextual cues. Future research could investigate how presenting participants with different behavioral contexts before the gesture is produced may impact interpretation. Within the large repertoires of great ape gestures, around 80 distinct gesture forms, we selected only 10 gesture forms based on their plausible production in typical human interactions, excluding forms such as pirouette and big loud scratch. While doing so limited our exploration of the full gestural repertoire, we wanted to rule out unsuccessful interpretations as a result of presenting participants with inappropriate gestures and meanings, a non-negligible confound. Now that we have established that the method works in principle to detect human understanding of great ape gestures, future investigation could explore a wider range of gesture forms, such as testing all manual gestures. We also limited our responses to meanings that have been established for chimpanzees, excluding our other closest living relative, the bonobo. While chimpanzees and bonobos share substantial overlap in their gesture forms and meanings, there remain some important differences in these closely related species. Given that both species are equally related to humans, the inclusion of more gestural form meaning pairings from bonobos may further expand our ability to detect points of gestural overlap. It will also be important to incorporate further research into ape gesture use across each species more broadly, including gorillas and orangutans, and to examine subspecies and population level overlap or variation. Through interdisciplinary collaboration between primatologists and linguists, our study pilots a new framework for comparative great ape gesture research. We test the idea that there may be a shared understanding of gestural form meaning pairings that are accessible to humans as well as other apes. It remains to be established whether these represent true ape universal gestures, for example, through the application of ape methods to the study of human gesture production. Potential meaning components would naturally be highly abstract, such as the notion of encouragement, which could form the core of a gesture that means give it to me or move closer, or a notion of discouragement, which could form the core of a gesture meaning stop that or move away. Our participants converged on a common meaning in 9 of 10 gesture forms, and these correspond with comparable chimpanzee meanings in 6 cases. We demonstrate further proof of concept that this new video-based forced choice approach can be extended to human interactions when testing the shared evolutionary roots of ape gesture. By finding that humans share their understanding of some gesture forms with chimpanzees, our results support the hypothesis of an underlying phylogenetically shared system of gesture that spans across ape species. We propose that future use and improvement of this experimental framework can help to address questions investigating the deep evolutionary origins of ape gesture, and uncovering potential universals of the shared system of four meaning pairings may reveal the deep evolutionary roots of language. Acknowledgements. We are very grateful to everyone who participated in and shared the study, and the Gorilla.sc team for their support with the testing platform. For helpful feedback and insightful discussion, we thank Emmanuel Shemlo, Noam Chomsky, Naomi Francis, and Felipe Schenkler. Finally, we thank the managing editor and 2 anonymous reviewers for their constructive feedback and exchanges that help strengthen the manuscript. And finally, thank you for listening to this audio recording. Once again, links to the original paper, including all the tables, figures, references, and supplementary materials, can be found in the links below. Or you can reach out and contact any of us if you have any further questions, comments, or just want to chat a bit. Thank you again. This has been Matthew Henderson, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.